we can be an example of how things can be different. Not impossible. Hey, we just had a remote off-grid city for 8 days operate in a carbon neutral environment. If we're talking in 7 years here, being able to claim we did this, I would be a very happy person. We would have provided the fertile soil for the impact that we'd like to have.
Meet the people who make Burning Man happen.
Around the world.
Dreamers and doers.
The artists, freaks, and fools.
Burning Man Live.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Burning Man Live. We missed you. I hope you missed us. Lots been going on since last time we spoke. You may be aware that back in 2020, we issued a 10-year sustainability roadmap with some pretty ambitious goals. We're 4 years into that now, and that roadmap to being not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative by 2030. Today, we're going to talk with one of the folks who is helping lead the charge on that very monumental effort. He is the Associate Director of our Off Fossil Fuels branch, which, of course, because we love to acronymize everything, he's the AD of OFF. He studied environmental science and public policy at Harvard. He's got a law degree from University of Virginia. He is George Reed, a.k.a. Georgie Boy, a.k.a. Gremlin. Hey, George, how you doing?
Hey, Stuart, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm good. I got a question, though. With all these aliases, are you hiding from somebody? What should I call you that won't get you in trouble?
Well, you've listed a couple. I have others. And one that's actually I'm liking more recently that you may have had some influence on is Curious George, feeling very, very aligned with the new theme of this year. I don't know if people have an aversion to the name George, but even before my Burning Man experiences, nicknames have followed me my whole life.
Well, Curious George is definitely a poster child for this year's Burning Man theme or next year's Burning Man theme. I've actually seen Curious Sir George memes. The man in the yellow hat looking suspiciously like our founder, Larry Harvey, just with his hat whitewashed yellow, or yellow washed. I don't know what the right word for that is. Hey, I want to start with, speaking of interesting words and phrases, something I ran across that you had made a reference to, invisible MOOP. Now, we talk a lot about MOOP on this program, matter out of place, which is anything, trash or treasure, which is where it shouldn't be. But what's invisible MOOP?
Well, it's a good question. I'm actually glad you started the conversation on this point because to me, it's somewhat the foundation of the work, or at least as I personally view it. Everything that we do, we always ask the question, why? Is it what's in our values? And to me leads to our principles, which in this case, the foundational principle I think that applies here is leaving no trace. And leaving no trace, meaning eliminating matter out of place. When we think about greenhouse gas emissions and particularly carbon emissions related to fossil fuels, we don't see it. The impacts are not felt immediately. It's not like seeing a plastic bag on the ground and picking it up and recycling it, or it's just invisible. I think it's really one of the fundamental causations of why we've gotten to this place globally. It is a tragedy of the commons to see nations all around the world emitting at the levels that they emit, but they don't necessarily directly feel the impact of their actions. So it's this invisible MOOP that we're polluting our world with that's having potentially one of the largest existential crises, or creating one of the largest existential crises that humanity's faced in modern history. I think that the concept of incorporating invisible MOOP as a cultural part of our leaving no trace endeavors and principles is foundational to what we're doing here.
And we've got burning right in our name, George. It is not the sequestering man, it is the burning man. And as Frankenstein's monster famously says, fire bad. Is it really possible? Are we ever going to get what we do in the desert, which is inherently burn shit up? How are we going to make that sustainable? Is it possible? I'll just start with that. Do you feel like it's possible to achieve our goals, very ambitious goals that we've set out in our roadmap, and still be Burning Man?
I actually do. And you have to really break down the problem into distinct pieces and then look at them one by one. Before I dive into that, I'm happy to touch a little bit on the strategy because there's two main pillars there, which is one, emission and damage reduction or mitigation. For that, we're conceptualizing a program that we're calling Net Zero Black Rock City currently. And then 2, removing carbon from the atmosphere, which is a much more regenerative innovation and regenerative practices that we're really focusing our year-round operations in northern Nevada on. So I'll get back into that a little more detail if you're interested. But one of the things that I like to say when people comment, hey, you're a Burning Man, when are you going to stop burning the man? Right? When we look at the problem of carbon emissions and the disruption to the carbon life cycle, which is really the problem, we all emit carbon dioxide when we breathe. Carbon dioxide gets emitted and then absorbed throughout a natural life cycle throughout history. The problem is we've disrupted that life cycle by taking millions and millions of year-old stores of carbon and taking them out of place and injecting them back in the atmosphere.
Dinosaur juice. Yeah.
The dinosaur juice, right? That took millions of years of natural cycles to get to that permanent storage space. When we burn a tree, the man, for example, that is a 10 to 30 year life cycle disruption of carbon, right? So we can theoretically plant a tree or the amount of trees that of any of that art that's built and over 30 years grow back, nurture that, and offset whatever the damage was from those emissions. If we're burning fossil fuels and tens or hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel, for example, that is going to take millions and millions of years for our ecosystem to reabsorb and get back into balance.
Hey, let's dive into some of the reduction efforts that have taken place just over the past year, both in Black Rock City and out in Gerlach and Northern Nevada properties where you're working.
Sure.
Let's kind of tick off the list. Let's start with how are we with starting to replace essential infrastructure that runs on diesel generators with solar?
So this year we took a really, really deep look at our own operations. In order to lead the community with integrity, we felt that it was important for us to really take a hard look at how do we do things ourselves. We put a working group together, Team BRC Ops. So that is big organizational leaders such as Chaos, who runs DPW, Hotspot, who runs all our fuel and utilities, Genie, who helps lead our power and design and initiatives there. And we did multiple things this year. One was expand our solar fleet. Our solar program is really meant to be primarily a demonstration and innovation division to model mobile solutions that camps can hopefully scale, build themselves ultimately. We powered with those. The big ones are the Unicorn. They're 2 container units. We powered the Man, the Temple, and Center Camp, all 100% on solar with those big units.
Sweet.
We had 2 other third-party units that we had purchased that we're testing. Those powered DMV and Ranger Outpost Zero, 100% on solar. And then we had a single container high power unit that powered all of gate operations this year. So it was 8 total there. And those, we call them the mobile pop-up solutions, right? And those are generally container-based solutions that can be shipped, packed, put up in a day or so, taken down, and redeployed. We actually redeploy those on our properties in Northern Nevada to take our operations on those properties off fossil fuels year round. We'll continue to develop that program and use them both on Playa as demos and then test them further to reduce our fossil fuel use in Northern Nevada until we have those completely off. The most powerful thing that we really did in terms of emission reduction this year was test batteries coupled with our generators this year on our grid.
I noticed that in my staff camp, the sound of generators was noticeably absent because we're running off of battery power. So what kind of net savings do we get off of a system that's designed like that to bank it and not be running like full capacity all the time?
It's a complex answer, and we don't have all the data yet on what happened here. We have anecdotal evidence, and we have data from last year. On our prototype circuit last year, we reduced our fuel use by 60 to 70% on that circuit by coupling the generator with battery. I don't know if it's going to have that large of an effect on every circuit. We coupled that with another initiative, which was more efficiently designing our circuits so that we used smaller generators. So we're going to have to see what that had on the overall fuel use reduction. But I'm personally anticipating it to be in the 50% plus range. I don't want to get too far ahead, but that's
cool.
what I'm guessing.
I understand there's also some experimentation done this year on renewable alternative fuels, right? Some kind of renewable diesel. What's the story on that?
So our strategy here is twofold. One, right, reduce our fuel use and then transition the remaining fuel that we need to renewable or less carbon intensive alternatives. What we've been testing the last 2 years, and we expanded to 8,000 gallons this year, is a fuel called R99, which means that it's 99% generated from essentially biogenic sources, old corn oil, waste products. It's a advanced biofuel, I would say.
It's from the deep fryer bin at Bruno's, isn't it? You're just sucking out the used French fry oil. No, I ran a car on R99 for years, and I was astonished to learn that the original diesel engine created by Hair Diesel ran on peanut oil. That was the original fuel, and the petrochemical alternate that was sort of shimmied in on everybody is actually way inferior, burns a lot filthier and everything else. So running on grease, cool. You went through 8,000 gallons of grease this year? Greasel.
Yeah.
Let's call it Greasel. It's way sexier than an acronym.
So we had a lot of Greasel. The exciting part about the programmatic side of that is we were able to pretty much test it in every major piece of equipment that we used, right? So part of this is getting a cultural acceptance as well as a corporate acceptance from the vendors and the other people that we use. If they say, no, we can't use it, we cannot expand the program. So what we really focused this year was getting consents from all the various vendors that we work for. Can we test this in here? We'll give you the reports. If it works, will you make sure that if we expand this, that we can use it in the future? So we really laid the groundwork for an expansion of that program, if it's the direction we want to go.
Well, I remember that when I converted a conventional diesel vehicle to Greasel, because it ran so much hotter and cleaner, I went through a lot of fuel filters. So I understand, probably from a rental truck point of view, that might be a concern on the part of the vendor, right? That there'd be more maintenance involved, at least for an initial period, yeah.
It's a concern, but it's mostly due to lack of knowledge. That was a problem caused by traditional biofuels, biodiesel. The R99 is a completely different processing mechanism. It actually burns cleaner. We had zero issues. The stuff ran cleaner. The stuff ran more efficiently. It was better than diesel. It did not have the same problems I think that we experienced in 2007-ish when we tried this here and others. So it's different, right? So it is not
new formulation.
Exactly.
Yeah, 2007, Green Man. I'm feeling a little bit of deja vu because I think we tried some of these things then, maybe a little bit out ahead of ourselves without the time hadn't quite come for it yet. But that was one of them, I remember. So alternative fuels, smart grids, solar power. Now, that's great for the organizational point of view, but what about for the vast majority of people who are burning fuel out there, which is all of our theme camps? What's going on out there? And what kind of options have we given for people who don't necessarily have a couple of $100,000 to reinvest in a solar array for their camp? How are they coming along?
Well, the community has actually been ahead of us in a lot of this. Just like anything else, you have leaders that emerge. We've had a lot of great work coming out of community-led efforts like RAT, Renewables for Artists team. I think they supported 24 artists this year, getting their art pieces completely onto solar and off of generators. Green Theme Camp has been working for years to collaborate on programs. They are now main contributors and participants in a new green corridor that we opened up this year. It was kind of spearheaded and birthed by Burners Without Borders, was a really big supporter of that program.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. So the Green Corridor was a clustering of camps who are running on alternate energy. Is that right? Zoning them all together, if you will. Is that right?
Yes. It doesn't mean that they are all 100% running on clean energy. It just means that they are committed to our goals and they're taking steps towards more sustainable operations. Being carbon negative is one of them, but a number of them are taking on other initiatives, things like composting. There's a camp Ideate that runs an entire participant-led organic composting collection operation. So we're seeing the community kind of step up and provide these services, collaborate. The concept of grouping them together, and this was the first year, was to provide a platform for them year over year to continue their collaboration, find ways that, hey, maybe we can link our grids similar to the things that we're doing. We have the luxury of a few things. One is buying power. We have some leverage in how we can negotiate things. We also have more sophisticated operations that we spend all year really planning. So we can we can really start to do that stuff more systematically and more programmatically. When you're trying to put together a camp and you don't know whether you're going to have 30 or 40 people this year, or you do this or that, it becomes a lot more complex. So allowing these folks to kind of start to collaborate long-term, set up some sort of infrastructures that they can evolve and incrementally improve each year is something that we wanted to give space to. And a lot of those groups, I think one of the qualifications that we had there was that they also participate in another participant-led group called BLAST, Burner Leadership Achieving Sustainable Theme Camps. The BLAST team of participant-led volunteers supported essentially a LEED certification, like a burner version of a LEED certification, looking at various sustainability. How do you handle your waste? How do you handle your water? How are you looking at your transportation? How are you looking at your energy, right? How are you looking at shade and other infrastructure? And they rank them similar to a MOOP map. And it encourages, collaboration, discussion, and incremental change around a host of sustainability-minded initiatives. And 46, I think, camps participated in that this year, which was pretty impressive.
Let's talk more about some of the things. Let's move beyond power, because there are so many other possible aspects and ways that we can reduce our overall carbon footprint. What about food recycling? You mentioned Ideate. We also have a pretty aggressive staff program, and I understand that's starting to run year-round for Nevada operations for all the folks up and around Gerlach. Is that right?
Absolutely. We've been, and folks like Blue have really led the charge here in pushing our own operations towards ecological handling of our waste is the way that we approach it, where we recycle and reuse our organic waste. I think we collect 100% of our organic waste from our commissary and our staff operations. Last year, we sent that organic waste down to a composting facility outside of Sparks. We actually bought it back. I think it was 120 cubic yards of it. We use it in a regenerative land rejuvenation and native species reintroduction project, as well as we're measuring carbon sequestration impact of seeding that soil in this way. So we're going to be looking every year at, hey, what are ways that we can regeneratively use this waste? There's discussion at Fly Ranch and the 360 around food growing operations. So utilizing this to stimulate production of food for the local community. But that's a program that we hope to continue and ideally either support through participant-led activities or in other ways the complete regenerative use of organic waste in our city.
I smell another episode in there. I'm pretty sure that we're going to get maybe Mr. Blue and Dumpster Muffin on and talk some more about that and get trashy about the trash. What about carbon reclamation? Are you aware of any carbon reclamation or sequestering projects that are going on that we should know about?
Well, we are in discussions with a number of academics, third-party startups. There's a bunch of discussion around new technologies evolving around what they call direct air capture, which is a lower energy intense way of actually physically removing carbon from the atmosphere. And then you can look and say, okay, what do we do with that? You can go all the way from liquefying it, putting it back in the earth, right? Putting it back into the long-term storage, reversing the damage that we've done. You can convert that into fuels. Ultimately, you can create renewable diesel with that carbon. So that you then create, a non-damaging cycle. It's not storing it, but at least it's not burning new stuff. And so we've been in discussions with Matt Sundquist over at Fly has been leading a lot of these discussions as well. We've done some webinars around credible projects that we believe are long-term carbon sequestration sources or opportunities of investment. Groups like Project Vesta, Climeworks. We would encourage folks to look at the webinars and materials that we've released around these things. And when you look at your travel emissions, for example, that's a natural place we would encourage participants to say, okay, here's my footprint for my travel. I'm going to tack on X dollars and invest in one of these projects and offset my footprint there.
Yeah, let's talk about that because, and I do encourage all of our listeners to go back and listen to actually several episodes we've had with Matt Sundquist on talking more specifically about this. One thing that I learned from him is that, when you look at our overall carbon footprint, something like 90% of it is getting to and from Black Rock City. Now, all the work of making the city itself carbon neutral, carbon negative seems achievable, but that one honestly seems unsurmountable to me. Within the next 7 years, is there going to be anything that you see coming up that's going to allow us to cut back on the amount of invisible MOOP that we generate just getting to and from our favorite city?
It's an interesting question, and it's something that goes back to the why are we doing this in my mind. But I've been looking at this really closely because we've been scoping about how do we define what the scope is when we say we're a net zero BlackRock city. What do we include? What do we not include? When I look at human participant travel to and from the event, and I calculate what the average emission profile is there, it is roughly equivalent to what I would call base case footprint of people just living in America. So what you have to think about is people then come here for 8 days and they ride around in bikes. They park their car and they ride around in bikes for 8 to 10 days. If you calculate what their emissions would have been for those 8 to 10 days, otherwise, if they were living and driving back 45 minutes to work or doing whatever they did, sitting in their houses, running their air conditioners, that footprint roughly equals, if not exceeds, when you count people carpooling and things like that, exceeds what the actual transportation emission profile is of participant travel getting to and from the event. So arguably, it's kind of a wash. We say, oh yeah, it's this, this is incremental, but it's really not. To assume that 80,000 people are going to sit in a teepee with no air conditioners for those 8 days and otherwise emit nothing, not go on vacation, not take their private jet to Monaco instead of Reno. So it's a question there of what's the actual incremental impact. I actually think the way that I look at participant travel in this bigger picture and what we're really trying to do, I look at it as a self-reliant thing, right? You should be measuring it. You should be aware of it. You should be thinking about it in your daily life, not just when you're coming back and forth to BlackRock City. Is Burning Man going to have a transformational change in the human transportation industry? I'm not sure that that's really what our voice is. And I think that we also value the impact of human gatherings more than saying this is too big of a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also argue that the incremental impact of people coming back and forth and what they actually do, especially if they're living now in a completely carbon neutral environment, will be net positive versus the travel emissions that we see there.
We have to keep it in perspective because even though it seems like we're in a petri dish out in BlackRock City, it is an American city. And yes, parking it for a week, how unlikely is that? Have you done that kind of analysis and look at us how we're doing compared to other comparable U.S. cities?
We have not done that specifically on like a city by city basis, but we've looked at it sort of more on an individual per capita kind of footprint. And obviously it seems bad, but it's much less than what we do in our daily lives.
Okay, so once we factor out driving on Playa, what's the breakdown between how much of the carbon footprint is generated by staff and by core infrastructure, and how much of it roughly is generated by the participants?
70% of the carbon emissions on Playa inside the trash fence are generated by participant operations and activities.
And not getting to and from BlackRock City, but operating inside the city, running their generators,
burning their art, burning their, the burn barrels, things like that. Participants have the lion's share of the challenge here.
If we just make staff net neutral, then we've dropped it 30%.
Well, that's true. And our hope is to get there sooner than 2030. The challenge is going to be how do we open access or how do participants come together to find solutions collectively. The participant achievements, I've got some stats. We've got 53% of our camps, so 671 of them work towards the sustainability roadmap. They made some sort of commitment to us this year. 868 camps, so almost 70% of camps sorted their waste into compost. I think I mentioned Ideate. They're hosting actually a whole collection facility essentially at their camp. 43% of our camps this year, that's 539 of them, use some form of renewable power. 20% of camps received sustainability tickets through the various programs, indicating that they were taking on something here. 245 camps participated in hubs, which is humans uniting for better sustainability. So besides the green corridor, which is kind of the main focus, we are starting to see participant-led groups just starting to form and do this themselves all over the place. So that's happening organically. 35% of our honorary art projects are working towards a sustainability roadmap. So they've made some program applications to move towards these goals. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening there in Black Rock City that's kind of coming out organically and participant driven. Close to 50% of camps right now are doing something here, which has been a really exciting development for us here. And it really been stemming from just the energy that's put out by the 2030 roadmap goals and giving some people some sort of lighthouse, guiding post. So we've been really excited about that, to see that just happening organically.
I want to talk about the people that you're working with. Tell me about the other folks that you're working with out in fabulous Gerlach and in Northern Nevada. Who are some of the folks that are contributing to this effort up there?
Sure. The way that I view my role is really more of a facilitator at this point. We work with various working groups and operational teams that actually have the ability to do things, right? When we first started this work a couple of years ago, we were trying to impose things. Oh, hey, let's put solar here. Oh, let's do this. Let's do that. And we started feeling pushback from the operational teams because these are folks that have spent decades fine-tuning their operations, and anything you throw in a monkey wrench, it just creates disruption. So we started feeling this tension of trying to push sustainability things on operational people who I think in some cases also weren't really necessarily feeling their voices were heard. So we opened it up and said, okay, you tell us what to do. And the feedback, it sort of opened the floodgates, which led to a lot of the successes that we've seen this year. Folks I mentioned, Chaos has been a huge collaborator for me on the operations side. Hotspot, Genie, Hazmat, the work that he does with looking at all the relationships and the vendor services and starting to embed this principle and embed these values in the decision-making process that they make. It's a slow burn. It's incremental, right? A lot of these contracts are multi-year, so we have to slowly, it's a lot of not sexy paperwork kind of background relationship things. Shay at OSS, president.
Outside services.
Exactly.
Which is where a lot of big generators and big RVs and all that stuff come from. So I can see how that would be an important piece of the puzzle.
To go back to the participant opportunities, one of the things that we're really focused on I would say, I call it phase 2, right? Phase 1 is kind of cleaning up our own house. We need to learn how do we do it? How we have to lead by integrity. We also need to open up those opportunities for participants to rationally have access to participation. As you mentioned before, it's hard to say, okay, go to solar. And they say, well, it's going to cost me $300,000 to put up a solar thing. And then I'm going to use it for 8 days. And then what do I do with it? And I got to have 20 people come and install it. And now my whole thing. Well, we say, hey, I'm pushing a little bit of a longer term program of a transition from OSS to sustainability site services, right? Where we work with innovative companies, people that are coming in, or innovative groups that want to offer products or services through OSS that allow access to participants to say, hey, instead of renting a generator, it's a little bit more expensive, but I'm going to rent this mobile solar from this group instead. We slowly need to phase out, if we're being authentic about our goal. The reality is that in 7 years, we won't be renting any diesel or fossil fuel based generators. We won't be selling any fossil fuel, period. That would be antithetical to the goal. So it's not going to happen next year. We're not going to ban generators next year and do something crazy, but we are going to start providing those opportunities or seeking ways that we can provide those opportunities with those groups and hopefully to provide a platform for demonstration and innovation for a lot of these folks. My preference would be for most of it, all of it, to be open source in some way. But I think to the extent that we do implement and transition these types of programs towards that, at a minimum, we want to have an open source platform where people can give feedback. We can see, hey, I rented this solar trailer from this group and it worked, or it didn't work, or they didn't say, or it broke and then they never came. Right? So we can kind of filter out, similar to the camp ranking system. But it becomes also a place of feedback for those folks that are developing these technologies. So it's a win-win. And that also helps accelerate the development of those other technologies and products that can then be brought out by those companies out into the world, other places. We've got a really great example of this with our new power vendor this year. We were testing these batteries, as I mentioned. We had 62 grids this year, 47 of them. So about 80% of them were coupled with these batteries. What that basically did is instead of running those batteries 24/7, they would run till the battery got to a certain charge level and they'd shut off. So that's why it was quiet for a good part of your time. Then the battery would drain down to a certain level and the generators would kick back on and charge it up. One, it reduced all that wasted fuel that we used to have where their generators are running 24/7. Now, in some cases, they're just running a couple hours a day. Why this is relevant to the feedback is when we first got those batteries in Gerlach, we tested everything. We have a pre-event, ops in northern Nevada where all the workers come in, they're building things up at the ranch and other places, and they're living there, hundreds of people. So we have to build a temporary power structure for them. The batteries were failing left and right. They were overheating. The programming was problematic. There was all sorts of issues.
This is new equipment for the vendor too, right?
New equipment for the vendor, cutting edge technologies, all made sense on paper. When you get out to the desert, things go wrong, right? Instead of throwing our hands up, and I've worked in a number of organizations throughout my career, 99% of them, when faced with this problem at this time frame right before the event, would have thrown up their hands and said, forget it. We can't do this. Too risky. What really impressed me about our team here, they buckled down. The vendor, the battery manufacturer flew in from Europe. The CEO flew in from Europe. They had developers. They had designers. They all came in. They did, I think, 14 reprogrammings of the software. Our team advised them on redesigns of the product to solve some of the problems that they had. And we were able to successfully implement it in Black Rock City. But more importantly now, these product manufacturers have a better product that's going to be usable in other situations outside of Black Rock City. So we really accelerated the development and usability of that equipment. We hope that our community can do that on an exponential level.
So you raised an interesting question when in the equation for theme campers, where do I store this when I'm not at Burning Man? That kind of applies to us too, doesn't it? If we are investing in a lot of solar infrastructure, primarily to fuel our event that's it's a few weeks or a month a year, how do the economics of that work to have it sit for 11 months of the year and not do anything for us?
Well, we don't do that. We actually redeploy our assets on our properties in northern Nevada.
Okay, so out at the ranch, and out at Fly, and various properties out there, I see.
Yep, so we use them. I actually have the plan for this solar department is until we reach what I'm calling a saturation point. Then we have to revisit how much new investment we're making into those assets, because we certainly don't want to have containers of solar panels, sitting around in a storage yard for sure.
I'm wondering if there's anything that's uniquely Burning Man about the approach that we're taking here. I don't know. I mean, if you go to In-N-Out, you can get animal style. In K-pop, you can get Gangnam style. Is there like a Burning Man style of sustainability work?
It's a good question. When I look at this issue, because I work for Burning Man Project, right? So I'm really primarily, at least in the near term, focused on our own operations. We've developed the internal platform to execute on that to be a collaborative and open one. So I do think that the way that we are addressing it internally is very much a Burning Man approach. When it comes to the participants, it's happening organically. We haven't stepped in much just because we normally don't with much anyway, unless some other regulatory agencies are requiring us to. So we've really been trying to provide the platforms and sort of the soil for feedback on that and opening up avenues for collaboration.
Okay, so collaborative, a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth, and a lot of creating a space for them to do it themselves is what I'm hearing. Is that right?
Yes, but I certainly think phase 2 and phase 3, where I think the organization can play a role, is starting to provide those baseline platforms, maybe online open source databases, Better Burner Bureau kind of feedback loop on the sustainability site services options, things like that, where we have a much more what I would call productive space where people can actually act on them. A lot of the things that I'm seeing here practically that exist today are kind of discussion forums, learn about solar, here's a Facebook group, but it's very difficult for people to find, what can I do? I want to build something like that. How do I do it? I'm not a solar designer. If I brought on somebody So providing platforms where people can really post, here's the designs. This is the material you would need. This is the amount of labor that it needs. Here's what it can actually power, where you can filter and start to look at those options of solutions and build out those databases, I think are things that we can do better and are things that we're definitely contemplating building out to support that. Certainly, I don't think that Burning Man's going to go down the route of providing these services ourselves, where we're going to go out and build a whole bunch of stuff and rent them to camps as an option. We do really want people to take ownership of this in a way. Part of the reason that I see as to why we do it is to get people thinking and to participate in this activity, right? It sinks in the experience that we have and the impact that we have as a community. The way that I think about it is stepping outside of our normal default reality and landing in a place where reality is different. That's always been the impact of the event for me. And it's before I joined here, why I would try to go every year, was it kind of cleared my brain of saying, this is the way things are. So, oh, it's not like that over here. Why is that? Oh, it can be different. The participation in that community and the transformative experience of being in that and existing in that alternative reality changes the way that people think. And I think it breaks down walls that oftentimes hold people back in moving forward in a certain direction. So we really do want to encourage people to take leadership, to think about these things, to participate, to engage in them. We don't necessarily want to make it just easy, and it's not going to be easy. People are going to have to find, even if they're just looking at alternative options and designs, it's going to still be difficult. But I think it's important that the community ultimately feels that this is a cultural mission that they are aligned with. I certainly feel it from the people that I speak to, but I probably have a self-selecting group of people that reach out to me.
Yeah, the climate change deniers are just not going to talk to you at all. I want to talk to you about getting some of that R99, because I just looked it up, and that is way better than the old B99 I used to run through the Jetta TDI. Yeah, sounds like a miracle fuel, which there probably is still very limited supply of. But hey, I want to talk about you, George Reed. Looking at your CV, you've had a very interesting and twisted path that's taken you from being a Harvard man to being a government employee to being a lawyer in New York City to now working for Burning Man. How did that work? And what do you think that sort of background brings with you to this role? Good or bad?
Well, I hope it's good. And it's interesting. My parents and my wife often ask me the same thing, how I got here.
You could have mounted to something, George. You could have amounted to something.
Well, you could have made money doing something, right? I studied environmental science and public policy in college. It was the first time that they had reignited that major at Harvard and made it was an honors only major. It was very heavy sciences, climate science. It was right around the time that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was being formed to advise the UN. And they had just released a report that for the first time announced that scientific consensus was that humans were having a discernible impact on the climate. So we were really diving in, okay, what are all the things that could happen in the next 50 years? It scared the shit out of me. It was the first time I had ever really thought about those things. It was not apparent to us the way that it is now. That really sunk in me and became a core part of my values, beliefs, and sort of understanding around the world. I worked in the White House in the climate change task force for a couple summers. When I went to law school, I thought I'd go back and work in the Gore administration. There were all sorts of bipartisan coalitions. It was happening at that time, and that's what I thought was going to do. So then I went to New York to practice corporate law. So I did that for about 5 or 6 years. It was really great. I learned a lot. So much of my professional skill set really looked at how to structure deals, structure relationships. And then I decided around the time I turned 30, I kind of had a early life crisis and said, what am I doing with my life? You know, I've been working 20 hours a day. I don't have really, it's hard for me to keep relationships. And I like the work. It's intellectually stimulating, but it's not fulfilling me. Buying a company, selling it, and laying off 1,000 people and a couple guys getting paid $50 million. And then, yay, let's go out to a steak dinner. And so I kind of stepped back and had some moments of reflection and decided that I wanted to dedicate my life to the acceleration of the adoption of clean technologies in the United States. I wrote it down on a napkin, and the rest of it's kind of followed to that. So I've always kind of looked at where I could have an impact towards that larger principled goal or my own personal mission. Worked in some clean tech investment, private equity kind of spots. I started getting into solar when that took off, got into community solar project development for the last like 8 years, which is really great, fun experience for me to work with dozens and dozens of local communities that were looking to implement these. So learned a lot about how communities work, how people can get things done, how to bring the right stakeholders together. And I've also run US divisions of larger companies where I've done, turnaround exercises or other sort of strategic growth exercises. So that's really helped me be able to look at this problem, at least organizationally, and put a little structure around it. And I believe I'm here because I think that we as a community have the ability to have a huge impact in this area. It may not be as simply defined, but I think the seeds that we can plant that have the ability to grow out into the world are exponential versus any impact that I'd be able to have in another place where we're typically chasing one solution and pushing ways to do that. So that's sort of how I got here. I'm still aligned with my mission, and I hope that the skill sets that I bring to the table have value to the organization and to the community. It's an honor to be here. I actually feel humbled very often with the caliber of people and the passion and everything around me. So
that leads perfectly into my next question. This is something I ask all my guests. You've been going to Burning Man since 2011. Why do you keep going back, and why do you think it matters to the world rather than just for you, for personal growth and transformation? Where's Burning Man's relevance in the world today?
Well, that's certainly a broader question than necessarily around my work, but it's related directly. I think for me personally, it's really about challenging my perception around the way things are. I think I mentioned earlier, the reason I have gone is to take myself outside of our default way of living. I think our brains get clicked into this thing where they're on operational mode 90, if not 99% of the time. And we wake up and we do the same thing and we go to work and we go, and you don't change, and we get into that rut, and things need to change. Things don't change in that system of just continual operation. So for me, it was a way of removing myself and then having that time to be separated, think about what am I doing, and start to uncrack and break down those walls in my brain. I'm hoping and I'm assuming that happens to other people. But the other aspect of it more broadly is just the human connection of being put in a world that is guided by the 10 principles, being in a decommodified space, being in a place where we feel a responsibility to each other and our campmates and other humans that goes beyond what we would normally have if I was sitting in the cafe downstairs underneath my building here. The connectiveness that we have, being present with each other without having a computer right in front of us or our phone connected to our ear. All of those things I think are really important for us to come and remember that we can come together as a community and we can do things differently. When we realize that, and when you have that experience, you realize you can go home and create that experience in other places. I see it happening in my personal community, my circle of friends. I don't know how this happened, but I would say 99% of my closest friends are all burners. And they really do live this. And I'm watching these things formulate. I live in Miami. I lived in New York for 20 years. There are enormous communities that are starting to really foment around these principles and these ways of living and having an impact on those communities very, very deeply. I do think it's important for us to get outside and have a central place of gathering. I know there's questions long term, over the next 10, 30, 50 years, can we still have the event out there? But I really think that our founders were very prescient to choose that location because it's such a distinct, you feel like you're landing on Mars, right? You literally feel like you're on another planet.
A couple more questions. Are there any misconceptions about Burning Man and sustainability out there that you'd like to take this opportunity to clear up?
I mean, I see a lot of misconceptions that Burning Man is doing nothing or doesn't care or is just ignoring it. I feel like I don't know how prevalent that view is, but I read all the blogs and everything. The reality is that we are taking it very seriously. I think, as I mentioned, we've been handling our waste ecologically for years. We're really looking to fully regeneratively utilize our waste and divert, recycle everything. We're looking at ways that we can transition all of our operation. We're transitioning from diesel light towers to solar light towers, where we test cased 4 electric UTVs this year. We want to do that properly, right? So we also have to ramp up our renewable generation, right? We don't want to be charging electric vehicles on diesel generators. So it's kind of like this balancing act of investment and strategy. We are doing things, I guess, is the message. I don't want to speak for others, but our operational leadership is feeling that we as an organization can get our operations to net zero in Black Rock City sooner than 2030. So I would hope to say that, hey, we as an organization have done this. These are the things that we've done, and here's the lessons that we've learned. The rest of it, I think, is going to be, how does the community receive this, from a cultural standpoint, and what do they want to do, and how much are they going to step up, and how can we support that, right? We always have that balance between, what are we promoting or telling people what to do, or in some cases even requiring people to do. Our hope is that we are able to provide enough platforms and carrots and pathways that people have access to, that they can come along with this journey with us. We understand that it's a challenge. It's very difficult to be coming over from Europe and land somewhere and somehow even just get your stuff there. Never mind have to think about, how do I completely transition my thing to a carbon neutral situation, right? We're exploring these things now, and I'm putting an open call here to the community. If people have ideas here or think that there's things that we can do here as an organization within our principles to support those efforts, we're in an open source listening mode right now. We've got some ideas and we're starting to coalesce around some things, but it's going to be an evolving process over 7 years. Some things are going to work, some things aren't going to work. My message, I think, for people now around this is, don't get overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem. I think a lot of people, myself included at times in my life, get paralyzed when they think about what a big issue it is. Climate change in general, never mind just like, how am I going to do my camp this way, right? And they say, it doesn't even matter, we're traveling there, so this, it's all, the world's going to burn anyway. And the reality is that whatever we do in Black Rock City, whatever the effects of climate change are going to still happen in Black Rock City. Us getting to zero emissions is not going to stop it, because we're a little drop in the bucket. It's the same problem that the entire world has, and it's probably one of the reasons why we've gotten ourselves in this place in the first place. What we can do is learn these lessons, take them and apply them and bring them back. Right now, I would encourage people to think incrementally. Right now, if people are saying, I don't know what to do, don't freak out or don't feel bad. Just take a little step. Just start thinking about it this year. Start to research things and propose ideas to your camp that maybe you implement next year. Look at what other camps are doing. Take notes. How much fuel did we use? How can we reduce half of it next year or a third of it next year? There's little things that we can start to do. And I think as we start to see those incremental changes being deployed, it's going to start to have a compound effect. That's our hope. We can be an example and beacon of hope, I think, to the world here. An example of how things can be different. Not impossible. Hey, we just had a remote off-grid city for 8 days operate in a carbon neutral environment. That's pretty transformative to see that possibility happen. If we're talking in 7 years here, Stuart, we're circling around being able to claim we did this. I would be a very happy person. We would have provided the fertile soil for the impact that we'd like to have.
Our guest is George Reed, a.k.a. Gremlin. He is director of Burning Man's Off-Fossil Fuels program. George, it's been really, really wonderful talking with you. Thanks so much for coming on the program, man.
Thank you all for the opportunity and the support.
All right.
I really do appreciate the opportunity to share this work.
Yeah, all right. Keep kicking ass. Thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone. Burning Man Live is a 100%, no kidding, non-profit production of the Philosophical Center of Burning Man Project, made possible entirely by the generous donations of listeners like you. So if you like what you're hearing, you want to hear more of it, go ahead, throw us a couple of bucks. The address is donate.burningman.org. Donate.burningman.org. And while you're in the neighborhood of our big rambling website,
slide on over to the house next door, which is live.burningman.org, where you'll find a full back catalog of all our shows, complete with show notes, transcripts, and who knows, maybe some special surprises. And while we're talking addresses, just change that dot to an arroba. Yeah, that's Spanish for @ sign. Send us email at live@burningman.org. Let us know what you think about the show. We are available in all the places you get podcasts. For telling a friend, thanks to all of you for that. Thanks to everyone here who made this episode possible. Our managing editor, Vav Michael Vav, K-Bot, Action Girl, Allie, Tyler B, DJ Toil, and the whole fabulous, sexy communications team at Burning Man Project. And thanks, Larry.